Have you always wanted to build your own Java Spring Boot REST controller in under 5-ish minutes? Well, my name is Wazoo, and I'm here to help you do that. Let's get going. When starting your own Java Spring Boot project, usually the best place to begin is at start.spring.io. This is called the Spring Initializer. It's pretty much the web version of a CLI tool that generates your project for you. So very similar to the Rails New for Ruby on Rails projects, etc. Okay, so as you can see, we've got a Maven project highlighted. That's what we're going to go with. Of course, we're going to be using Java. The Spring Boot version we're going to go with is version 2.4.5. Really, it doesn't matter too much as long as it's the latest version that's sort of available by the time you try this out for yourself. For our project metadata, we really don't need to do much here. We can fill out a group name, which is just a way to sort of organize your project into different folders if you want to create and tackle different projects after this. So I'm going to call this one just com.wazooinc, and then usually the artifact and the name itself is pretty much the same thing. I'm just going to go with welcome. That's all we're doing here. So for description, again, you can leave this blank, or you can just type in something like a welcome project for Java Spring Boot. Hooray! And this will automatically generate the package name for you. Again, it's just sort of Java conventions that organize your code base into a structure for when you have multiple projects in the same area of your hard drive. So for packaging, we want to keep it a jar file. We're going to go with Java 16. And back up here on our dependencies list, right now for this project, all I want to do is use Spring Web. In the Java Spring Boot world, dependencies are similar to sort of plugins that you might think of in other languages. This is where you can use different technologies to interact with the same components in your Java Spring Boot project. So for example, if you have a database that's on MySQL, then you can use the MySQL dependency, or if you decide that you want to use a different database, say MySQL for development and then Postgres for production, you can have both of these as dependencies in your project and use one for each environment. We're not going to worry about anything about that right now. As I said, we're just going to use Spring Web. So now that we're finished all that, let's just hit the generate button. Boink. Hey everyone, as you can see, I've downloaded the zip file and I've extracted it just to my desktop on my hard drive. I've opened up the project in Visual Studio Code, and this is all we have so far. The Spring Boot Initializer generates a project template structure that lets us get started in Java Spring Boot development right away. We have our pom.xml file, which is our main Maven file that is pretty much the backbone behind your entire project. It defines all of the dependencies you need, the Java version you're using, and various other sort of environment configuration options. So it's pretty important. The other file of note is our application.properties file, and this is a configuration that is read in during startup of your Spring Boot server, and it sort of lets you define various things within the engine that go beyond any of the default settings that you might want to change depending on what you're working on. We'll touch on that in a minute, but first what I usually like to do is just run it right away and see what happens right out of the box. So all you've got to do in Visual Studio Code is hit F5. As you can see, it's starting it up in its own debug console window, and everything should now be running. The important thing of note here is that Tomcat is now embedded within Spring Boot, and it's listening on port 8080. So let's go ahead and open it up in your favorite browser. As you can see here, we get the white label error page, which, believe it or not, is a good sign. It means the Spring Boot server is up and running, and it's listening for web requests. Now, we haven't defined anything to return back to the browser, which is why we're getting the lovely error message, but that's what we'll take care of right away. So let's go ahead and stop our server. Okay, now all we have to do is in the welcome, remember our Java package structure that we defined as com.wazooinc.welcome. all we've got to do is add a new class, and we're just going to call it the welcome controller. Okay, and we are going to give it a annotation of REST controller. So Java, if you haven't done much Java development, or if it's been a while for you, Spring Boot works with a system of what they call annotations. That's what this @ sign in front of a word means. And that's sort of a signal, a magic keyword to Spring Boot to make it take care of various tasks that you don't have to do anything to take advantage of. So for example, for this REST controller that we're putting together right now, there's really not much in terms of code that we have to set up. We just have to put in this annotation, and Spring Boot will take care of the rest for us. All of the sort of dirty underpinning work that needs to get done. And we'll use another annotation called get mapping. And I think you'll be able to figure out what it's doing in just a second. We're going to use the default route of /. And what we're going to do is call the welcome function. We're going to create a welcome function, and all it's going to do is just say return, hello, this is Java Spring Boot. Booyah. Okay, so now if we go ahead and save it and then hit F5 again. Good. There we go, everyone. Hello, this is Java Spring Boot. Booyah. Nice. So we've got it up and running, and we'll come back and explain this line here. So the get mapping is a shorthand for the handling the get request, the get HTTP request. In under 5-ish minutes, we've put together our own REST controller in Java Spring Boot, and we've returned some text to the browser. I hope you enjoyed this video. Give it a like, and be sure to tell your friends about it. Now, if you want to stick around, why don't we tackle some bonus material? So the first bonus tip we're going to go through is changing the server port that we're listening on. Now, by default, Java Spring Boot will listen to port 8080, as you've been seeing in the startup log file, but we're going to change it to 3000. And why 3000? Because I like to work on different platforms, and I like to keep everything consistent, at least on the server ports. So when I toggle between Ruby on Rails or Node.js, I usually like to keep everything on the same port of 3000. So we're going to go ahead and define server.port equals 3000 in our application.properties file, which I was mentioning earlier. That was a way for you to configure the Spring Boot server. So let's go ahead and restart it. Restart the server, and then scroll back to our logging, and you should see down here Tomcat started on port 3000. So let's go ahead. So on port 80 at 8080, as you might imagine, we don't get any response because our Spring Boot server is no longer tied to that port doing any listening. So let's update it to 3000. Nice, that worked. Time for bonus tip number 2. I had just finished mentioning about the logging that comes out from Java Spring Boot. This is sort of the default log level, which is sort of Java terminology for defining what comes out on the console as you're running the server. So usually when we're running it on what we call a production environment, so if you've got it available for anyone in your family to visit, for example, or any of your friends, you don't want the logging level too low, or you'll get a lot of messages for events that are happening in your system that aren't going to really be useful. If people are just hitting your website and going to, say, a link that you've sent them, you may not appreciate getting a whole ton of logging that comes out from the server side, because you should know beforehand what you're expecting to happen when people show up at your site. So what you can do is change the logging level. So for example, when you're working on development or working on your own machine, you want to increase the logging level to something like a debug. As you might see, there's an info logging level here. There's debug, which is kind of among the lowest. It's not the lowest, but it's the second lowest. The lowest level of logging that you can put on your application is called trace, and I definitely don't recommend it. It is just too much noise. This is only useful if you're really looking for a very, very specific issue that nothing else can find, and you've run out of other options for capturing. But as you climb higher than info, you'll be seeing less and less showing up in the logs. So after info is warn, or maybe it's warn then info. I think it's warn after info, then warn, and then error. And error is pretty much the quietest. Only exceptions or major issues that happen during the operation of the server will show up in the error logs. So what we want to do is, why don't we change this to debug, and then I can show you how Spring Boot handles the requests that we're sending to that default route. So let's go ahead and change logging.level.web, which basically defines the logging level filter for all of the web components. Let's call it debug. Well, not let's call it. Let's use the debug log level setting. Okay, let's save it. Go ahead and restart it. And you can see right away that there's an increase in the amount of messages coming through in the console here. See these debug messages? Okay. So now let's go ahead and refresh our page. Okay, and we can see that there's a lot more sort of output in the log file. So I can show you what we can glean from this. So here we've got our message that Tomcat has started on port 3000, which is great, and then starts to put in a lot more debug messages of all of the web frameworks that are then sort of kicked off by Java Spring Boot, and they're waiting there internally to handle any message that or any request or message that we're sending to the web server. So here, for example, it's processing the request of our default get to our default route, and then it in turn signals that we're mapping to our com.wazooinc.welcome.welcome controller welcome method, which is what we just finished creating. And then it decides that, okay, we want to respond with our string of text. And then along with that, we're also sending a 200 OK, which is the HTTP status code that everything is fine with our web request. Cool. Hope you enjoyed that, and be sure to stick around, and I'll be posting more tutorials on Java Spring Boot and other technology soon. Have a really great day.